Okay, hi everybody. This is the third Zoom that we're having today with John Connor and Dan Ming. And I wanted to start with Dan actually, and it's actually something you did quite recently, and something I've been looking forward to, which is obviously Top Gun Maverick. And I've been watching behind the scenes, and I saw the cockpit with all the Venices in the Rialto mode. It's quite new. So how did you test that, and how did that work on the G-force? Because that's something that I was just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, so to get cameras in the plane, first the Navy was just like no, and then we had to do a mock-up on we did on a T-38, which is a Czech jet, and we shot a test in a Czech jet, and then we showed them what the footage looks like, and they're like, oh, the footage is really cool. So then they had us build a mock-up in an F-18, and then so once we built the mock-up in the F-18 and showed them what we wanted to do, then they said okay, and then we got sent to NavAir in DC, where we had to design and machine the plates that mount to the camera with the grips and the jet. So the Navy had to build everything that attached to the plane, and then they gave us plates that we could attach the cameras to. So once we did that, then we had to take it to a wind tunnel to test for wind speed, and we had to do G-force tests and shock and vibration tests. And that's because if something goes wrong when the cockpit pops up, the first thing that gets hit is that whole camera rig. And so if it's loose, it's going to shear off and slam right into the back seater, so which is Tom. So they were like, we had to be really careful. And so I think they tested it to Mach 0.9. They tested it just below the speed of sound, and they let us do 7.5 Gs and fly at 35,000 feet. And then we had to get a special waiver for the lithium ion batteries we used, because we weren't allowed to tie into the F-18 electrical system because we didn't know which jet we would be getting necessarily. And as we were going through all the jets, we noticed every jet is slightly different. So the mounting points were slightly different, where everything was a little different. So we had to be certified for specific jets, and then we had to have special plates made for those specific jets.
So that was a long test.
Yeah, because we had two on. So the way it works is the cockpit goes up and down like this. So we had two cameras mounted two Rialtos mounted front facing to go over the shoulder of the pilots. So that he would wear, say, the Maverick helmet, the actual pilot, and it would be over his shoulders, so you saw what he was flying. And then in the back seat, we had a Rialto. We had 4 cameras. We had 3 on the bottom and 1 top center facing him. And so we had a wide Rialto, top center, to see everything. And then we had 3 full Venices without the deck on the bottom row. And we shot everything on S/S in there because there was just no room for the raw recorder. And it took us months. And but when we were done, everyone was like, wow, we didn't actually think they'd let you do it. So, but they were like, well, we didn't say anything, and it all worked out. So.
Yeah, because it seemed like quite an interesting setup for a camera, which is that new. Because what interested me about it is that were you the first one to shot on the camera in the Rialto mode and everything? Did it do anything strange to the sensor? Because that was my.
All our Rialtos were prototypes from Sony.
That's
when
amazing.
we started the movie, we were on beta firmware, and I think right before we started, we got like the first stable film firmwares, and we had to stay on that for the whole show, which ended up, like, by the time we were done, I think we were 2 firmwares behind, because we shot for like 14 months. And so by the time we ended, the firmware was just like, we're like, oh, let's change the speed or something. And they're like, oh, you can't really do the same thing on this firmware as you can on the current firmware. So we were limited. We had to keep all the prototypes because those prototypes were the ones that were certified to go on the planes, because they weren't as well made, which they liked, because if they had to eject, it would just rip the cable right out. The newer ones are much sturdier than the older prototypes were. But in our case, it helped.
And how, because I can imagine that made you feel a little bit uncomfortable shooting with a camera, which you don't know that well.
I feel like as camera assistants these days, we're constantly being given new stuff and told to make it work. So it's kind of just our job now to just be given some random camera and say, oh, we want to shoot a movie with it. You're like, okay, how do you make it work? But luckily we had been working with the Venices, Claudio and me and Bob and everyone else. We had helped Sony like test and develop the Venice. So we actually had been working with the Venice for more than a year before Top Gun actually started.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. Then you have, at least you can tell them that's a rig or something is not working for you, or yeah, that's really nice. But that is a quite extreme situation. But John, you've been in even a more extreme situation with the Revenant. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it's quite a different situation, but yes, almost as intense. For sure.
Yeah, and I was actually wondering, why did you took on the job? Because it's so extreme. I can imagine that it's maybe too much.
I don't think if I had the experiences and knowledge that I had from years of working, that I would have been able to pull it off. And I can understand why 56 people didn't want to pull it off and had quit the job. You know, some fired, but most walked off the job at some point. But where I was in my career, I mean, I had already shot 2 features at the time, so I really didn't want to do it. I turned the movie down, 3 or 4 times. It was offered to Dan as well. I called Dan Ming up and I was like, dude, can you do this movie? I don't want to do it. And Dan's like, I'm busy.
I was like, if you don't do it, I'll do it. But then you decided to do it, so I was like, okay.
Yeah, it was great. I decided to go up, and when I got there, I realized what we were doing, and I also saw the crew morale was pretty out the window at the time. The Canadian crew was amazing, I gotta say, and Dan Ming has worked with the same people I have. And when the 2 days after I got there, Alejandro took the entire crew aside, and he took me into the office first before the first AD, and we all, on the way home from work one night, he just shut the production down and said, we need to talk to the entire crew about how we work on set, and how it was such a technical movie that as soon as we would cut, everyone would be like, oh, did this work, did that work, that didn't work. And the actors were acting their hearts out, obviously, in the conditions that they were, which were all real. And it just became this breakdown. And Alejandro sat me and Chivo down, and him behind the desk, and everyone else is in their foul weather gear, still just sitting in the lobby waiting to get lashed. And I'd been there 2 days, and he said, what can I do? Who can I fire? Who can I hire to make this go better? And I was like, the experience that I've had in the past, and on this project since I've been here 48 hours, I'd say there's nothing you can do with this crew. This crew is the best crew I've seen in years, and you'll never get anything better out of this crew. And I said, maybe we get 3 sets of lenses, so every camera that we decide, they would literally decide the camera they use mid-take or even mid-scene. They would switch it up. Okay, let's wait, this isn't working, let's go Technochrome. Okay, wait, that's not working, let's go Steadicam. And then we do 2 takes on the Steadicam, and Shiva would go, no, get out, Scott, we're doing this handheld. So we had lenses on every camera ready to go, whatever the call was, which was normally the 12 or the 14, but that was on all 3 cameras ready to go at a change notice. And there was no delay, which, we all know that that's not much of a delay. But we had 3 camera crews servicing 1 camera, basically. So 1 ultimate shooting camera at all times. There was never really 2 cameras pulled off. But once I got there and I saw what we were doing, and I saw the crew morale, and one thing I've always been a huge thing of is a crew morale, and Dan Ming and I see Eric Messerschmidt and many people here, John Tanaka. You know, everyone knows that I like to work hard, you know, but I have a good time doing it. So I told Alejandro, I said, why don't you show the crew what you have on the movie? No one's ever seen anything. And he was like, okay, good. Then he called the first AD, and I walk out the door, and the first AD's like, how'd it go? And I was like, yeah, it's good. Good luck. And you know, he did great. Obviously he got yelled at, and Scott Robinson, fantastic AD. And there was a whole new regime that broke down the next day, and Scott had to be an asshole to everyone on the crew, basically. So it was actually pretty stressful after that. But ultimately, he showed him the movie, and the whole crew was just, holy cow, look at this. I mean, they showed us the bear sequence with the, you know, not all the elements, obviously, and the opening sequence, which I actually wasn't involved in. You know, I came in 6 weeks into it, after Todd Schlopey walked off. But it just gave a whole new value of the movie, and everyone knew that they were doing something epic. And then from there out, it went pretty well. And then obviously went really bad when we ran out of snow and shut down the movie for a few months, and then came back, and it was the worst winter on record, which affected us and Hateful Eight. It affected anyone that was shooting a winter movie at the time. And we shut down and then went to the Southern Hemisphere and started again. But truly, I couldn't have done it without all the experiences that I've had. And I probably would have turned away after 2 days of doing it. We had an assistant come out from France, and he watched me one day. He was going to replace me. I was just going to leave. And he basically got one of the worst days on the show. It was snowing, and the rivers bulged, and it came into the set, and we went from, you know, a little powder on the ground to 1.5 feet of snow. And shooting the movie, you know, in sequence, all of a sudden it didn't work, so we had to shut down. We couldn't continue the movie. They couldn't get the snow off the ground. It didn't match. It didn't work. So yeah, it was beyond the challengings that we had. And then I came there, and none of the lenses were working. There was out of focus shots every day, and I'm sure Todd was dealing with it. And we still, to this day, never sat down and talked about it. I saw him at Panavision once, and I was like, "Hey, you're the guy, and how'd it go?" And oh, fuck it. And but anyway, I came on, and then literally was doing lens tests every day, trying to figure out what's wrong with the wide lenses, you know. And Chivo thought it was the cameras, so he sent all the cameras back to Vancouver. They sent a special company out, you know, to Panavision to get them out and check the cameras on between the hours that we were shooting overnight, and that wasn't it. And then it was good, and then we'd get a wide shot, and we'd go to dailies, and it was soft. It was at 12 feet at 1.3 on a 14 millimeter, and it was on the tree in front of us. It was 10 feet out of focus, and 10 feet even on a 14. We couldn't see it on the monitors on set. You know, we couldn't see it until we projected it. And so every day I was shooting tests. I had one camera team shooting tests, trying to, you know, figure it out, and, you know, putting charts out at 12 feet and on the left sides of camera and the front sides of camera, you know. And then Panavision gets a call from the studio and the producers, and they're like, you know, well, we've been shooting movies in Canada for years, you know, who's this guy pulling focus? Maybe it's him. You know, so that was tough to take, and that pressure every day. And so finally, I called on the guru, Dan Sasaki, and I said, I got this problem. And he says back focus. And I was like, yeah, of course. That's probably it, but it's not always there. And he's like, well, what's the temperatures? And I said, well, we happen to be in a place that the temperature can change like 15, 20 degrees when these winds come up out of nowhere. They call them the Chinook winds. And I'm like, yeah, so we can go from 15 to below to 15 above in the matter of an hour. And he said, well, that's probably your problem. And I started shooting tests, and I was like, sure enough, on the cold mornings when we would look at everything, and then it was just out when we would shoot in the midday, and then we would only shoot in the hours that the sun was setting, so it was the coldest hours. But we would also shoot to rehearse during the sunny hours, and those never made it into the movie, but those were the ones we were seeing in dailies. And the cold ones were the ones that were in dailies that were all bad. And so I had Panavision give me 3 sets of lenses, one that worked at 15 below, one that worked at 0, and one that worked at 15 above. So now I had 6 sets of lenses, but we only needed the 12 and the 14 and maybe the 18. But Chivo jumped between the Leicas and the Zeiss because he loved the flare and the Zeiss, and everything's backlit, obviously. So the Leicas didn't have as cool of a flare for him. So, but he didn't want to carry the weight of the Master Prime. So he wanted that new Leica 16 had just come out back then. It was like the only one in town. Auto had it, but to rent the 16, you had to rent the entire set. So we had an entire set of Leicas, but only used the 16. But yeah, it was really challenging to figure that out. And once I figured that out, and we used a laser and tested the back of the lens, and we said, okay, guys, we're at 15. All right. And then I had to make the call. It was like a football game. I had to make the call before the shot would get going, because once we got the shot going, we couldn't change the lens. So I had to anticipate the temperature drops, and I had someone on weather the whole time, and it was just I couldn't imagine, other than that and keeping your feet warm, were the most difficult things about the job. The focus, for me, I had always used the Preston. I pulled it off the Steadicam many years ago on a movie called The Fan. And Reggie Newkirk actually came up with the idea of, because pitchers travel like 4 to 6 feet when they pitch, and we were on 600 and 800 millimeter lenses with Tony Scott. And during the tests, we were like, how the hell are we going to do this? We had the Light Ranger 1, but still someone had to operate that off to the side, and it had crosshairs in the middle. And, you needed 2 operators basically to work that. And there was only 2. In fact, there was only 1 for a while, I think, Dan. That was a whole nother process that we weren't ready to do. And just, it was a special order item. It was $1,500 a day. They weren't going to go for it. And they didn't understand our problems as focus pullers. We were just trying to make sure we had it. So we would put a camera off to the side, and then ran a cable to to our camera, and put the monitor on there. And then we'd have someone stand out there with a slate and put a mark in the center, and there and there. And then wherever they went, we just literally pulled focus like that on my monitor. And it worked beautifully until the grips put a 12x up in front of us. So then the camera and the marks were all no good, and we would try to switch it, but then the 12x is on the other side, and so that's where I came up with the idea of taking the Preston off the Steadicam. And I asked the Steadicam guy, and he was like, but then I'm not going to have one on the Steadicam. And so I said, I'll get it back. We'll make a quick release bracket. And we did. And John Rodriguez worked on that, and a quick release bracket on the follow focus. I had quite a few operators tweaked with me in the beginning when they couldn't just grab the knob. And I kind of became known as this guy that's not going to let you have the focus. But I was always on. And then I got a monitor. I got a little TV that had UHF, and we had the little modulus black and white, and I had a 1-inch screen, and I could kind of see where things were for timing of racks, and how to anticipate who's in foreground or back, and where to have the focus. And I started using the focus off to the side, which I think became the name the Conator after a while.
Also the IFB on the operator's eyepiece used.
Yeah. And then I would put headphones on, and the operator could actually tell me, like Colin Anderson on a couple of movies. It was so difficult focus-wise that I really had to be connected with the operator still. But then that became the way. I was on 400, 600 millimeter lenses off to the side with the Preston, and it was so easy. It was the easiest thing to do was to pull focus all of a sudden off to the side. And then it kind of took off from there. Sorry, guys. But that pretty much wraps it up as far as that. Sorry to sequence into that, but I kind of sequenced in some of the questions that you had as well about the pulling focus and the Preston and all that jazz.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I have actually another question for Dan, because I have been Googling you and obviously looking into your IMDb account. And I saw that the beginning of your career was actually, well, that's what it says on IMDb is CSI, which is a TV series a few years ago. And after that features, and now again, a TV series. How do you think that it evolved? As in the comparison between features and TV series nowadays and how it was before? It's a big difference, or?
It is. I mean, working on a television show, obviously depending on the show, sometimes feels like you're going to work in a factory, and you're always shooting the same sets. The hours are usually long. People are just worried about page counts and getting the day done, and the narrative repeats every 8 days or so because they start the next episode. So I've done a couple of series, and at the end of them I was always like, oh, I don't know if I could do another one. And I think after I said that about 3 times, I just decided, like, if I could, if I have a feature, I'm happy to day play on series or a pilot, but it's, you have to continue to love what you're doing. And it really frequently made me just like kind of not love going to work every day. And I hated that feeling. So, in terms of, as I tell people, I'm like, look, if you're doing this for money and not for love, you're probably going to be really miserable, because if you don't love what you're doing, you're not going to make it through the hard times, because half the time on some jobs when things are just really, really crappy, I'm just happy because of the people I'm surrounded with and my crew, and we're in it together and we love what we're doing, and so it becomes more about that than the actual job itself. And that's kind of what gets you through the hard times. And I just want to love what I do, and so a lot of the decisions I've made have been more based on that than anything else.
And do you feel that TV series have changed in the way that we make them now, in terms of Netflix and quality, actually?
Well, I mean, like CSI Miami was shot on film. It was 35 millimeter, and we were always on 11:1. So on that show, I used the sniper, which was great. It was a very narrow beam. You can aim it exactly where you wanted to, and I also had the panning. I put it on a motor so that I could, pan left and right to kind of like take measurements in the frame. And so that helped a lot, because though you can get tape marks and kind of get an idea of the geography of the room, once, David Caruso came on set, then you're just like, you just had to do whatever happened and get it right. And once you figured out your system, it was fine. But again, it was the repetition. Like now, I feel like there are some TV shows out there that are more creative and more fun as there were back then. Honestly, every show is its own thing. So to say TV is bad is kind of too broad of a paintbrush. It all depends on the project.
Yeah. I understand. So when you make a decision for a job, it's actually, you have some criteria, like fun people, nice scripts.
Exactly. Like this last job that I worked on right before this world shut down, I was in Tokyo on a Michael Mann pilot. And honestly, Max, my second AC, and I, we were like, oh, we hear all these stories about people getting yelled at by Michael Mann. I'm like, I haven't been yelled at by Michael Mann before. I want to do that. I want that on my list of things that have happened to me. So we kind of just went out there with the attitude like, hey, like, we're in Tokyo, the food is amazing. We love to eat. So we're like, as long as we have each other, it's going to be fine. And so we went out there with that attitude, and, he was great. It was awesome. We had a great time. The locations are tiny. You could like literally carry like 4 things and then the room was full, but we had a great time, and, I enjoyed working with Michael Mann. And so, it all became a super positive experience that we weren't expecting. But I think it was also because of we went there with expectations that were maybe a little low, and everything ended up being way better than we thought. So it ended up being an amazing experience.
And is that a little bit that what John's saying, that it's like some sort of sad morality, or that the crew is everybody is facing the same direction, and then something magical could happen because you've both been on features which have won prizes, and is that something that you experience on the set where you actually feel, like John said, where he actually feels like he's making this amazing movie? Have you experienced that as well on a project?
The project where I actually was like, this is going to win an Oscar was Life of Pi while we were making it.
How come?
And it was, well, we could, we were shooting 3D. So technically it was insane, but we would, watch the dailies every day. And you could just see, with Aang directing and all the performances, you could see that it was just going to be an amazing, epic thing. And just, as I told Claudio, I'm like, hey, this is going to be really something special. And it ended up being as incredible as the experience it was making it, which doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes you have an amazing time making a movie, and then you see it and you're like, oh well, at least I had a great time making it.
I think that's quite international, where it's like really nice on the set of the movie. Most of the time is not that.
And what's interesting is that I was offered the movie and didn't want to do it. So I thought Dan would have been the best person for the job. I thought he would get along with Claudio, and they're both very technical. And I was like, I wouldn't normally even suggest someone on a project like that, because if you get the wrong person in there, it's obviously not going to work. But Dan and I had done a few things together, and I was trying to shoot at that point, and I just didn't want to go away that long. So yeah, to have missed the prize on that one, it was great to get it on my last movie as a focus puller too, which then I also asked Dan to do.
Yeah, John is.
Congrats.
I definitely consider John my mentor. Like we briefly met on Skeleton Key with that
Right.
Daniel shot, and then it kind of rolled into Mission Impossible. And I think that only happened because you were going to China, and that C camera only could have a local crew. And so I just happened, I speak enough Chinese to be able to work on a movie set and eat, which is the most important thing. So
and that made us a powerhouse team between both of us out there on that movie. I knew we could do it. And the great late, our B camera was, fantastic as well. So it was great to have a team. And again, Scott Rathner, it was, again, it goes back to that team, and it was challenging. Every day is a challenge with Tom Cruise, on the set. So you're stepping into that. You have to be on your A game all the time. It's same thing with David Fincher. Same thing with Tony Scott. These directors are so loyal, but if you're not on the team, you're not there. You're not asked back, and it's great to be on those teams. And even on Life of Pi, they brought on a local in every department and taught them the business. I mean, there was that movie was just amazing in itself, and winning the award obviously, and everything that they were about while filming that movie was fantastic. So I'm glad it worked out for everybody.
Oh, it's lovely to hear. There's one of my colleagues in the chat whose name is Aiden, and he has a question. Clemens, can you unmute? Oh, he's unmuted.
Yep, I'm muted. No, I just had a couple of questions. So going back to Revenant, John, on the Steady School Zoom, you talked about how the only way you got through that show was because you knew timing, and you learned timing from kind of the analog world. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but also in the digital world, what is a good way to learn timing? Do you have any tips? Yeah,
that's a good one to teach it now. That's something Dan would probably be a lot better at. I did step away from focus pulling almost 7 years ago, other than the Revenant. and I've really stepped away from it. I did it for a long time. And to gather that now, like I think I told the story about the guy that couldn't do the shot pushing into the door off a monitor and never was able to do the shot because he hadn't done marks. So marks is definitely the thing, but it's, you know, it's just as you're getting closer and you're pulling focus, you know, you're looking at a monitor now. So the timing is all really off your eyes and video game type stuff, where it was the physical side of it. Seeing an actor walk forward, you know, was the only way. And that's what I, you know, just got really good from doing it for 20 years. I mean, I don't even think it's something you could teach in a day or a year or 5 years. You know, it just was just from doing it all, you know. So that's why I was able to adapt that to Revenant, because I had to pull focus on the monitor inside of 3 feet. You know, there was just no way. But I had to have it on me. I wasn't, there was only one shot and Chivo flipped out when I did it, pulled focus from a different room. And he's like, "Can you do that? No, you cannot do this. No, no." He's like freaking out, literally did not want me to do it. And, you know, and then that brought up, you know, okay, can we get this shot? You know, and then Alejandro clicked in and he's like, "Wait a minute, is there a problem?" And then the first AD's like, "Hang on, guys." And then all the actors were like, "Holy shit." And, yeah, it's, you know, and then you have to adapt and not let anyone know what you're doing. So I had to really quick, you know, establish a style. And I literally, you know, went by eye, and me and Scott Rathner and some of the assistants that have been doing it for a long time would just stand next to the camera. We wouldn't even need to run a tape. I didn't need to run a tape, you know, in my latter years inside of 5 feet. And then inside of 5 feet, I kind of, you know, went off the Cinetape, which is all I had. Basically, I was never one of the lucky ones to have my own Panatape, and those had to be kind of matched together, and the tubes and the readouts, and you really kind of had to hang on to yours. And even though I was a Panabrat in the beginning, I never thought that I was the type of person to like hang on to gear, although a lot of people did do that, and the gear was gone. It wasn't even at Panavision for a lot of the years. So you couldn't get your hands on some of the tools that were available in the beginning. So you really had to be able to do it analog and know how to do it. But the timing is just, you know, it's just experience again, down to that. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, another thing about timing is that, you know, that's where it also comes to like on an emotional, artistic level, you're kind of basically, I just base my timing on doing what my eye wants to see. So if I'm watching something and literally if something in the background happens that distracts me, but I feel is like relevant, I'll just pull focus to it because you're watching this frame and your eye is reacting to what happens in the frame. So, you know, like when
you're watching the movie.
Yeah, when somebody's head turns to look at something else, sometimes it's like, oh, that he's actually has something really interesting going on his face. So I'll just stay on him. And then after you capture that moment, then I'm like, okay, now what's that guy in the background doing? And then I'll pull focus. So you're kind of like, what's the intent of the scene? You know, even though this guy is not the main character, but if what he's doing affects what the main character does, then it's worth noting what he's doing if he does something interesting. So, you know, that's kind of how I base my timing in terms of when to pull focus and so on and so forth. And in terms of, you know, pulling focus, a lot of us, we try to stick to one ring because after a while, you know exactly where you are on the ring based on how far you turn your
muscle
wrist.
memory.
I know if I'm at 4 feet and I turn this far, then I'll be at 6 feet. Whereas like, so
the Preston definitely helped that whole system because pulling focus on all kinds of different lenses off the knob was different every time. But you were able to make your timing the same no matter what the lens was with the Preston. And that was really the magic of the Preston is at one point you didn't have to look at your hand. You'd look down and you go, oh shit, yeah, I'm right where I wanted to be. But that was one reason I did adapt the Preston was because you would look at the camera and then you'd look at the actor and then you'd look at the camera and the actors moved. So I would always pull focus with the Preston with the focus in my eye line and the actor, and I never missed. Yeah.
the nom in the foreground, the actor in the background, kind of.
Yeah, I see some assistants still doing that today. They're pretty intense.
I still do that.
Yeah.
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 I mean, it's
Some
just
do it to the side.
sometimes things just happen so quickly that
I have it. I watch over my monitor. It's like a triangle. It's
Yep,
we all look
triangulation.
we look like a full focus pulling. Honestly.
Yeah, there should be some good video of that somewhere.
that's also the other thing. It's like some people are like, "Oh, you're looking at a monitor. It's cheating." And for me, it's like there is no cheating in focus pulling. You just have to do whatever it takes to get it in focus, because ultimately no one's going to care. Like if the dailies are soft the next day and you're like, well, I didn't want to cheat, then they're like, oh, well, that doesn't matter because you're fired anyway. So you're like, just no, the best thing to do is just to not be noticed. When a focus puller is noticed, it's a bad thing. The best thing to do is just to not anyone know you're doing your job, because usually when someone knows you're doing your job, it's because you screwed up. And like, don't expect any pat on the backs, but expect for everyone to point out if you buzzed a shot.
Yeah, it can be brutal. And it's nice to know how you did when you go home these days with the digital age. I do have to say the stress that we had, not knowing till the next day, usually at lunch. So you still had to go a half a day of working on set, and as soon as everyone knows, and it didn't happen to me a lot. I don't think it happened to Dan a lot, and some of the faces I see here, I'm sure. But when it did happen, and I have replaced people for it, and it's brutal. It's almost like a shaming it's like you feel bad. Everyone's back doing it again because of you. It's the stress of that, and sometimes it was over a weekend, so your whole weekend was affected. What's wrong with you? Oh, nothing. I might have blown this shot. All right, let's go. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's a huge part of your life. So the digital age, I was enjoying that at the end of my career, folks.
Yeah, I mean,
I didn't think it was cheating. I never thought it was cheating. To get it, like Dan said, whatever it takes to get the shot.
I mean, one example of that, and this is a difference between the film days and the digital days. You spoke up more. I spoke up more on a film shoot. There was a shot in Lincoln where Tommy Lee Jones was coming in into the House of Representatives and sits down, and we were on a lambda head. So George Billinger, the operator, was operating off a monitor. So whenever that happens, then you're like, there's no one looking at focus except for you. So you're the only one who can say it's in focus. And so, we did a couple takes, and Spielberg was like, cut print. And then I went to check the gate. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. Because I checked the gate and I put it back on, and I realized, like, were the marks lined up? Had I reset the pressed in? Was it off? So I was like, oh crap. So I said, Steven, I need another one. And this was like, after they had, told Tommy he could leave. And he was like, what do you mean you need another one? And George Billinger was like, Dan, I think it was okay. And I'm like, yeah, but what if it wasn't? And so I said, I'm sorry, I need another one. And Steven was like, well, what happened? And this is where I learned, like, don't blame your equipment. It doesn't matter what happens. All that matters is you need another take. So at that point, you just say, I screwed up. I'm sorry. I need another one. Because if you start making excuses, then it actually makes them more angry at you. It's better to just get the anger out all over with all at once. Say, it's my fault because I'm the focus puller and I messed up. It doesn't matter what technically went wrong. That's my domain, and I just have to fall on the sword. And so, we got another take, and it was great in dailies, and it turned out the other takes were also great. So I was like, I didn't have to call it, but if it was not in focus, then it would have been really bad. So you just have to you just had to, unless you were absolutely sure, you had to say something. And so it was probably one of the hardest things I had to do, because Tommy Lee Jones was kind of grumpy, and it was Spielberg. But you just have to do what you have to do, and that is just, you just have to realize that's your job, and if something is wrong, you have to say something. There's no like hiding your head in the sand and hoping things will be okay.
No, it's like there's every Zoom that it comes back where the job of focus pulling is the mistake is so visible, and it makes it so difficult you see, the sound guy, no one knows what he did wrong, but for focus, everybody's looking at it, and now everybody's on their monitors or their apps or whatever.
Yeah.
Everybody's judging you for your
Yeah.
mistake. So
Still
yeah.
a tough job, no doubt, I'm sure, even though
Yeah.
the times have changed. You know, there was so many other things to worry about, like your, you know, your flange. You wouldn't know if that was out until dailies, where, you know, you see what you get now on digital. So you had to deal with that. I went on Fight Club, I went and did a near miss of a car stunt 6 times, and then went to check the gate, and there was no film in the camera. The other assistant didn't thread the mag. The mag was on the camera, but it wasn't threaded. You know, there was a lot of things that, you know, I mean, the digital age, yeah, you can still screw up some things, you know, or format a card, which I've also done, but never flashed a mag, but put the wrong film stock in a mag once. That didn't go over too well. But yeah, the job is still very difficult, and I would never take anything from any focus pullers today. They still have the hardest job on the set, for sure.
And also these days, also it's about, especially on the bigger movies, like on Top Gun, I remember a few really difficult shots, but that movie was so much more about logistics and planning and, you know, organizing units and gear and having things in place so that everything would work. And like the focus pulling part actually became just as important, but it's actually, I did very, in terms of what I had to do on that movie, I just don't remember the focus pulling as much because
I know you had lens issues, though. You did have, you know, some issues on that 105 with it, you know, not coming up the same, and you know, they were challenged nonstop, but none of that ever, that was all behind the scenes. No one ever really knew that. Tom certainly didn't.
yeah.
Everything was just, you know, everyone just smoothed over all the rough stuff to deal with that, which is also key in the assistant's job, you know, is to field all that stuff, and, you know, constantly switching your priorities for, you know, you have an agenda to, let's do it, we're going to go into this way and do it, and then freaking, you know, everything hits the fan, and okay, let's go to plan B, which there is no plan B, which is winging it, and you just do it and you get it. So there was definitely some stress on that movie, but some good people behind it and a great crew to support you, and that's what makes an assistant able to make those calls and those change ups and nail it, is the crew behind them.
Yeah, and also like, you know, having a great crew, and then production realizing that, hey, if you're gonna ask the impossible, like I'll do whatever it takes, but you have to realize it's gonna take resources. There was a day when we were at Top Gun, which is now in Nevada, and you know, they're like, oh, Tom's gonna take off, but uh but the plane is gonna go to the carrier. So we were in
Yeah.
we were in Nevada, but the plane was going to fly. We had a crew in Nevada, and then also had a crew at sea on a carrier, and the plane was going to fly from Nevada to the carrier, but there was no communication with the carrier because just the way they work, you can't just call someone on a carrier. And wanted to stop in San Diego and, you know, refuel and swap things and then fly to the carrier. And this was like the day before, so I'm like, well, okay, we need to have an assistant in San Diego with, you know, fresh media and fresh batteries, and then we need to somehow tell the guys on the carrier that that plane's going to land, and they're going to be cameras rolling on there, and they have to, you know, get it off and get the media off. And so it was like, okay, let's, you know, call the crew, got to San Diego, and then I don't even know how they told the guys on the carrier. I assume somebody, you know,
Just call them.
called.
How,
But
how many crew did we end up employing again in the local
well,
camera?
we had almost 100 local 600 members, but I remember in June of last year we had 2 cameras on stage, and then we had like a C camera on stage, and then we had 2 F-18 interior jet rigs to do, that's 12 cameras, and then we had a F-18 exterior mount which was another 4 cameras. And then we had 2 ground-to-air teams, which had to be on top of mountains. So we had a helilift, we had a helicopter, 4 camera crews on top of 2 separate mountains for when the planes would fly underneath them. And then we also had a crew on the Pacific Ocean for a sailing scene at the same time. Plus, we had air-to-air crew. We had I think we had a T-38. The only way to chase a fighter jet is to chase it with another fighter jet. So we had modified heads on the jets that could take a lot of wind resistance. So we had 2 cameras. We had 1 jet that could have 1 camera, and then we had another jet that could have 2 cameras. And it was a twin engine jet because when it had to fly out to sea at the carrier, they needed more safety. We can just use a single engine jet in case something went wrong. So I think between all that, we had like maybe 30 cameras spread out everywhere at the same time. And it's just managing all the crews. So you hire the best people you can, tell them what you need done, and just send them on their way. And, you know, if you have good people, things get done, and you just have to check in once in a while as things change, you know.
So that was the recent Top Gun.
Yes.
But there's also someone else in the chat who did the first Top Gun. I don't know if he minds if I ask him a question. That's your dad.
You still there,
John.
Dad?
Yeah, he's still here. I can see him. Can you unmute him?
As long as it isn't too hard to answer.
It's not. It's actually a simple question. Did you also had 30 plus cameras on your Top Gun shoot?
Well, we only had 2 cameras, an A and B camera, and then the aerial unit, I don't know what they had. I never saw their setup. And when we did the stage work, which was the inside of the cockpit, we only had 2 cameras on stage.
So that's a big difference then from now compared to what you did.
Oh yeah, it was, and to the stage work where we had a 10K light that our gaffer could rotate around so that when the plane went upside down, that 10K would move so it looked like he was upside down. So we had continually, the light was always moving. So that was kind of cool.
It's got
yeah, and this one Tom didn't want to do. He wanted to do all the practical flying. We shot only 2 days of blue screen, and I'm not even sure why we did that in the cockpit, but I remember rigging it for a week. Yeah, it was quite different. And that for two cameras, Tony Scott was pretty known for 5 cameras pretty much on any movie he did after Top Gun.
Well, I think all of that stage work with Tom, I think he came out of there pretty bored. And he probably said, I don't want to do that again.
He wants his next movie in space, right?
Exactly. International Space Station.
That's an extended midlife crisis, maybe. So, John, the dad, are you? Well, your son worked on the new one. How did that make you feel as maybe a proud dad or a worried dad, maybe?
Unbelievable that he would be there doing the operating, and when I did the operating on the first one, and he was on the set sometimes on the original Top Gun, but I couldn't be prouder of him and accomplishing that. And it's too bad that Tony wasn't there to do the second one.
Yeah, that would have been amazing. But Tom did appreciate it. Tom saw my dad. He came out to the set when we were in Tahoe, and he literally halted the production of everything going on this big ass movie to spend a minute to talk to my dad and me and take a picture, which I can't post for another. When is it coming out now? Next summer now? Is it?
I don't know. Did they move it past Christmas?
I don't know. I hope not. But yeah, it was fantastic. It was great, and he really appreciated 2 generations Top Gun, and it was a pretty cool moment to have my dad there, and to have worked, and chasing my dad's shadow all his life, and to be able to do that, that was pretty awesome to end up there too. And Dan Ming actually had a lot to do with that. Me being there, I would have been there obviously with Tony Scott, and I would have had Dan there, but we worked together so much that he ended up ultimately getting me back in with Claudio, because I kind of stepped away and let him take over. And so yeah, it was pretty interesting how it all came full circle. It was pretty awesome to have Dad there.
And that's also why it's like, you work with so many people. It's, mentoring people and teaching people. It's, we're a guild, and it's really all about passing your knowledge on to others so that they can, it's knowledge kept to yourself is kind of selfish. You've gotta spread what you know, because we're all in this together, and the better people you are surrounded with, the better you look. So to try to be like the top dog and to keep others down never is helpful. But like I was talking to Claudio and Joe, I'm like, Connor's got to be the A camera operator, because I'm like, that's what Tony would want. And I think after I said that, then that's what sealed the deal. They're like, yeah, totally.
Yeah, it was a little bit of nostalgia which got me there, but ultimately, I mean, it's just awesome that it kind of comes around like that. But my dad taught me that, and he instilled that way of working, and I passed that on, and I think a lot of people are in there. Used to be really difficult people to work with, and they've kind of been filtered out of the business. So it's pretty awesome to work with great people, and they'll do anything for you. And that's what Tony believed in. He would hike up a mountain, but he wouldn't hike up any mountain that he wouldn't expect you to go up anything he couldn't go up. But that's a double-edged sword, because he could go up just about anything. But the challenge in that we love what we do. It's, again, like I said before, it's not a job, it's a way of life. For us, I don't know what that way of life is now. But
it is the waiting game a little.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the country where you live in, honestly.
And also we are carny folk. We're like in the circus. So part of doing this is having dry times and rich times. And so even though it sucks as a job, we have had training in not working for months. Like I cannot work with the best of them.
Yes, I cannot pull focus.
My colleague Aiden has another question. There he is. Oh.
It's kind of hard to follow up everything that was just said, because that was some really good discussion. No, I just because we were talking about Top Gun and about kind of the custom solutions and all that stuff. Dan, I heard on a podcast that you actually have an engineering background. Did that come into play at all? I mean, obviously on Top Gun when you guys were designing the housings, but have you used that on other movies before? Have you made custom solutions for anything?
He's doing it on set all day. I'll say real quick before you say.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Like having a degree in engineering is really taught me how to think a certain way, and actually how to be more dispassionate when things go crazy. So, I will say it has helped numerous times, frequently. It's, yeah, especially on Top Gun, because there are just some things where it's like, it taught me how to approach a problem. When you have a task that seems monumental, you kind of discard what is possible and what is not, and then you figure out what you have to do to make it happen. And then once you figure out what has to happen, then you break it down into, okay, what can we do now? And what do we have to invent? And then once you figure out what you have to invent, then you invent those things and tie it in with what you can do. And then you kind of see what comes out the other side. And I'd say 99% of the time, it does not come out the way that you hope it will. But teaches you something about what you do need to do to make it work. And so on Top Gun, you know, every day was a challenge. Just wiring the cameras in the F-18s from not doing it to our end product required so much work, because the Navy, you know, it's all about safety, because those planes are flying fast, and the primary thing was to not have anyone hurt, because if something happened to one of those planes because we were filming Top Gun, it would be over. Like that movie would be done. And so we had a huge responsibility. It was all about safety first, and then making sure, like early on, we engineered, with the help of Kesla, we engineered a button. There was one button you push and it rolled all the cameras in the plane. And one of the jets, which is the one Tom Cruise was in, I think every time they would go inverted, the cameras would cut. And it happened on 2 sorties. And so we had to go back to Keslo, and we ended up, because there was a computer in there, because initially when we did the initial design, we had a sound deck that would be recording the audio as well. And it just ended up being too much gear. We couldn't get it certified with the Navy, so we yanked the sound deck, but the old switch was still in with the computer, and there was something loose on one of the boards that caused the cameras to cut whenever the plane went inverted. And so we designed it to a solid state system and had to rebuild it and rewire the whole jet, and then it was super solid from that point on. Actually, from that point on, we had no problems at all. I think we must have flown 6 or 7 weeks total of sorties, and you're talking, you know, usually 2 flights a day with at least 2 jets per flight. And so, because when you see the movie and Tom is in a plane and he's looking over his shoulder talking to someone else in the other plane, it's because he's in that plane and they're flying that other plane over there, and that person is in that plane and he's talking to that person. Like, that's how he wanted to do it. He didn't want to like talk to a plane that wasn't there. It's like, if he looks over there and is talking to another fighter jet, that jet better be there. And so we had some flights where we had 6 planes in the air, because, you know, you have adversaries, and then you had like 4 regular jets of the attackers. And so it became this, the Top Gun pilots who were flying for us were like, this is fun, because the Navy would never let us fly this way. Like, if we flew this way for the actual Navy, we would lose our wings. And so they're always talking about like what they're going to do on their last flight. Like, on my last flight before I retire, I'm going to like fly under a bridge, because I've always wanted to do that. And then, you know, but if you do that, you lose your wings. But they're like, I'm retiring anyway, so it doesn't matter. And so like the stuff that we had shots where, you know, you have like 4 planes in a row and they're right on top of each other, but slightly above. But if you're a fighter pilot, you actually can't see the plane in front of you. And so we had 4 planes flying in tight formation, and the pilot in front would be radioing the pilot behind him to tell him where he was, because the pilot behind him couldn't actually see his plane. And so like, I remember some pilots coming back going like, I do not want to do that again. So but I think it'll all show in the movie. It's going to be pretty amazing.
I can't wait for 2021, I hope. I'm definitely going to see it. I'm very curious. There's someone else in the Zoom who has a question, and that's Leanne.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leanne Leonard, and I had a question. So I'm a film student right now, and I eventually want to become a DP, but I also love working for Stacy. And so I wanted to know, what advice would you recommend as to moving up the ladder and making connections out of film school?
Connor, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the future holds for what process to do, but I mean, obviously, time in each position is important to know, you know, what those positions require once you're a cinematographer. It teaches you patience, you know, waiting for the gear and what it takes to, you know, do it, you know it. which I'm at, you know, I'll be a firm believer in walking a mile in each position's shoes. But and I wouldn't, obviously, I think I've mentioned before, I don't know if anyone's heard that, you know, obviously you stay in something too long, you get stuck in that position. So there's a fine line of how long you do it. And but I always wanted to be very good at each position. I wanted to be the best second, I wanted to be the best first, and I wanted to be the best operator. And obviously that you can, but not to the point where you're, you know, moving too fast or too slow. But you pretty much, like the military, you earn your wings in each position that you're at there. And yeah, it's just meeting people, and again, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. So your personality is a big part of it, and how you deal with situations. People notice that, and most of your work comes from other people. You know, like Dan gets me calls, or I'll call him, and I know, you know, each job's different, so you know who's good for what job. There's certain people that are good for some jobs and some that aren't. You want to be as versatile as you can, so you're good at every job, so someone can call and go, you know what, that person's got that, or she's get really good at this, or he's really good at that. And it's, I've always hired the people under me who've impressed me at their jobs, whatever they are, male, female, black, white, whoever's good at their job is how I've always hired people below me. So that road is a very strange road now, because a lot of people just start out cinematographers, and they'll come right out of school just as a cinematographer. And you know, me and Mitch Dubin have been working a lot lately together, and we've, you know, been talking about it, and we just both feel that you really do need to you know, do those positions to know what you're doing as a cinematographer. But Dan, how do you see that?
Right. I mean, like, I can share kind of like how I came up. I was always, well, I was always interested in camera, but I just wanted to get on set. So I think I was a art department PA on a short, and it was a freebie. And then the first AC got a call for a paying gig, so he like took off. And then the producer, who knew I was interested in camera, was like, "Hey, you want to pull focus?" And I was like, I just match how far things are with the numbers on the lens. He's like, yeah. The PP was like, yeah, yeah, that's what you do. I was like, oh, okay. So I did it, and everything was fine. And he's like, you're really good. I'm like, what do you mean? I just did what you told me to. And he's like, yeah, but how do you know that's 5 feet? How do you know that's 6 feet? I'm like, well, that's just 6 feet. So that's what I did. And he's like, yeah, but that, you know, it's like people sometimes have trouble judging how far things are. So I had that, you know, I was lucky enough to be able to have figured out the hard part, just because I don't know if it's engineering or what. But then, you know, after I had done a couple of low budget things, I was like, you know, I feel like I need to know what the whole camera department does. So I went back and I loaded on 2 movies, and then I seconded on a movie, and then I went back to focus pulling. And I haven't looked back since, but I will say it is really important to know what the other jobs are, and what makes a good loader, what makes a good second, what makes a good, you know, all the positions. Because, you know, ultimately, as you move up the ladder, it's not that you want to be able to boss everyone around because you know better, but it's because you want to be able to recognize quickly when somebody knows what they're doing. You could actually trust them more and not have to, you know, micromanage. Because most of the time, as an A first, is you're just juggling so many balls. You need to know who you can trust and who you can't, but you need to know right away. The second most important thing is work ethic. Like, and Connor and I have talked about this a lot of times. Frequently, when you're given a choice between someone who has an amazing resume and, you know, is a little crusty about it, versus someone who, you know, has the potential to be really good and it has really great, you know, work ethic, I personally will choose the person who has the desire and the drive and has strong work ethic, because, you know, they'll be receptive to like taking in knowledge and applying it and become better. Like, maybe they aren't better than the other person is now, but they will be with experience. And then what you've done is now you have another experienced whatever focus puller or second or loader that you've trained that has great work attitude, and now the whole industry is better because of it. And I think that's why, as Connor was saying, a lot of the crustier guys have kind of, fallen out because people just realize when you're on set 14 hours a day and things are awful, you want to be surrounded by people who will keep you up, not people who are, just don't want to be there.
And it's knowing when to move up as well. At one point, I think I mentioned in the last one, Zoom, that at one point I moved up to focus, and I was with my dad on a TV show, and the operator moved up, so I moved up to first. And I had done 3 episodes as the first, and I was just loving it. I was just like, oh my God, this is great. I had been seconding for 5 to 7 years, and loaded for 3 to 5 before that, was a camera PA for a year before that. And then I was just a PA for a good year before that, not even in camera. I used to take the film to the lab at the end of the night. So I walked a mile in all those shoes. And then I got offered Die Hard 2, but as a second assistant. And I was like, oh no, no way, I'm a first now. I'm doing this. And my dad was like, no, you're fired. And he pushed me away. He didn't say I was fired, but he pushed me off the job. And I'm like, Dad, what's up? I want to be a first, work with you. And he's like, nope. So it was the best thing I ever did. He pushed me away. I went back down to a second. It was a big movie. I made all kinds of new contacts. I met assistants, and I went from there. I went back to second assistant a few times, but after that, I was taken as first assistant on those bigger movies on the B camera, where you're a little more protected, although the shots can be more difficult, longer lens, not as technical as the A, obviously. But I bounced back and forth a few times, but at one point I was just done. I couldn't do the second A anymore, and I knew that, and I just had to stop turning down. I had to start turning down second jobs, and at that time it's tough, and every position is tough to move up in. And I did the same with operator. I fell back, and now I moved up to DP, and I've kind of fallen back to operate on bigger movies, but I'm shooting smaller movies. And that actually has worked out really well right now because there are no big movies. So I'm shooting a bunch of little movies right now. I'm actually working 2 to 3 days a week for the next 4 weeks straight, just doing very, very, very small projects, 10-man crew, 10-person crew. I don't even get a key grip or gaffer on some of them. I'm doing everything, but it's weird to be able to bounce around in this business, but you can. But at one point, you'll become unhappy at what you're doing, and that's what you don't want to project. Is that you're sick of that position. So it's a timing thing, and sometimes that timing doesn't work out with how much work there is out there. But it's a tricky one, and I didn't know when to move up, when to stop turning jobs as an AC. It was like on Revenant, I was pulling focus for 20 something years, and I just answered the phone every day and worked every day. I worked a lot. I worked almost 70,000 hours to this point in my career, and in the union, not including non-union hours, which who knows what those were. But I didn't know when to move up to DP. I didn't know when that would be. And thanks to the social network, unlike the old days, someone had to hear that you moved up, and then someone had to tell another person, well, that guy's really good, or that girl's really good. I moved up with a lot of people throughout the years, but I didn't know when to stop turning down and move up in the union and say, I'm not taking first AC jobs anymore. But our DIT, Arthur Toe, shot the end of the movie. Chivo said, and this is John Connor's last time pulling focus, and he put my hand up, and that went out on the internet, and the phone never rang again. As a first assistant, it never rang again, and I never pulled focus again after that night. So the social network, and you got to be careful with what you project. I see a lot of people on their Instagrams, their AC operator, DP, director on their Instagram. So, you know, it's a different world, obviously, but I agree, you know, with Dan. You do have to, you know, work in those positions to know what's required of a cinematographer. I think it's huge. You know, to remain nameless, on the last project we did, Fargo, the DP was let go because they didn't know what they were doing, but they were hired because, you know, there's a whole new world out there of putting people in that they didn't know how to do things. They didn't know how to get a camera where it needed to be. They didn't know how to light someone from below without seeing the light in the shot and a reflection. It was like all those little things that we got to see as assistants and watch some DPs fail and some DPs learn their lessons and some DPs do really well. You're literally going to school for each position when you watch, and when you get to a good point of where you're good at your own job, that you can actually watch the jobs above you. Because first assistant was so tough that I couldn't watch a lot of the cinematographers that I was working with which were amazing, and I'm bummed that I couldn't really pay attention to where they put the light and where they, you know. So I have a kind of broad strokes of cinematographers, and watching my dad, you know, work and stuff. And when I worked with him, he didn't give me any leeway. We shot wide open. I had to learn the hard way with him. He didn't give me the easy road. If anything, I think he gave me the harder road, me better. So yeah.
I can see him smiling in the chat.
Yeah, I can't see him right now.
I can't see him. He's on mute, but we can see him smiling and nodding. He agrees.
All through it though, Connor, you know, always had a great attitude. He always worked so hard. Like, you know, now that he's moved up, like I would do anything to help Connor. Like if I hear about something, I always throw his name in. Like, so if you work hard and you know, you have a great network, when you move up, all these people are behind you and they will help you move up. Like, John was saying about his dad, you know, he kicked him out not because he wanted to get rid of him, but because he knew that, you know, it would push him forward. And so, and
propelled me forward.
People that push you forward are the people who you've worked with and have relationships with.
Yeah. There's another question in the chat, which is Nicholas.
Thank you.
Or Nicholas? I don't know. Where are you from, actually? I was just wondering.
Hey, gang. I'm Nick Kramer, full name Nicholas Kramer. How are you, John? Hi, Dan. Hey, John. Hey. So, number one, this has been amazing, and thanks for putting this on. It's been very cool to listen to all you guys' story. Duck Grossberg from Life of Pi says hi, by the way. Awesome. Yeah, he even goes, tell him hi, drop my name for me.
Yeah.
Like, okay. But I wanted to kind of go back to what you were talking about earlier, a little bit more on Top Gun, I suppose, but I would love to hear about any of both your adventures, Dan and John, in regards to kind of the coordination that being an ACAM first or any first AC, really, I'm curious about regarding controlling the coming and going of gear, planning ahead when you've got things that are adapting a little bit. Are you delegating a lot of that to your second to kind of take care of, or are you doing hands-on the weekend? Like, are you ever sleeping? Are there pills you can recommend? I'm just curious about your process in that, as well as everything else you've been talking about.
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, well, first most important thing is having a super solid A camera second, because especially, you know, it all starts at the prep. So Max, who is my second, and Tucker Cordy, who was my second on Life of Pi, who's now a DP. I mean, they were amazing. When you're at a prep and you start prepping for a movie, there are so many phone calls and so many emails, and so half the time you're just sitting there typing it on the phone and you can't get anything done. And so, you know, when I prep, I always say, like, it's got to be me, but my second has to be there. Otherwise, it's the same as like not getting anything done at all. And, you know, it's delegating. Like, you know, all our additional firsts on Top Gun, Bob Smathers, Mateo, you know, just everyone we brought in. I could say, hey, you know, we need this camera on top of the mountain. We probably need to find a helicopter somewhere and, you know, find, you know, a bunch of cameras and take it up there. And you probably need, it's probably gonna be below 0 too. Okay. And it's like, fine. Okay. And then done. It's done. You say when you need it and where it's gonna be. And then you could just write it down to follow up, because you're gonna have to tell them about what lenses and what gear they're gonna need. But all the logistics of doing it, they're gonna take it over and run with it. And so that's so much about delegating, because when we wrap, Max and I will sit down and we'll go over the whole schedule, and we'll break down the gear. It's really labor intensive. And then the UPM on Top Gun was like, well, what's this going to cost, because things were changing so fast. So we would sit down and figure out the cost of doing everything, and how we could arrange units so that maybe it was a little more efficient. But
are you keeping spreadsheets with all of this stuff?
Oh yeah, I had a spreadsheet set up where I had units, and then what equipment was in each unit, and then I had another thing of like how much this unit cost. And so, but it was super labor intensive. But if they're suddenly like, we got to move the carrier unit 2 weeks because the carrier has a broken screw, but now we're going to do air to air and ground to air on those days, and you move the calendar around, then suddenly you're like, oh, that camera I needed in the air to air was originally supposed to be part of the ground to air, so now I need an extra body to make up for that. And so you have to order extra equipment, and frequently things would change on a daily basis. At some point, I believe around week 20, the UPM just stopped asking me for how much things would cost, which is great, because then you just change stuff, and I would just tell her this is what's happening, and she'd just be like, fine. Because a lot of the times it would be Tom wanted to do something, he wanted to make something better, so he's like, let's do that. Or it was, I remember one time we were supposed to deploy on the Roosevelt out of San Diego, and we were all getting set up for that, and then the Navy said, oh, that had to deploy to Korea, because at that time there's this whole North Korea, South Korea thing going on. And so the carrier we're supposed to be on went to Korea, and they're like, but you could have the Roosevelt, and that's based out of Norfolk in Virginia. So why don't you guys go there? And for them, it's just the Navy works all around the world, and they're constantly juggling, things. But for us, it was a matter of like, oh, we got to get this package. Instead of just driving down to San Diego, we have to get it to Virginia and on a carrier in Virginia. And so it's you just, at some point, you don't think about how hard things are. You just have to think about what you need to do to get it done, and then just get it done.
Yeah, I gave a lot of the the responsibilities to the second assistant as well. In the beginning, as a second assistant, I wasn't allowed to touch the camera. I certainly wasn't allowed to thread the camera ever. It's changed a lot these days. It's become a lot more executive. Mainly my second assistant, Jesse Roth. I've had countless numbers of second assistants, and I've never let one go. In a sense, they've always gone off and done things and gone above me and around. But I've had many seconds only because they've moved on. In fact, I could name probably 20 of them who are great operators and DPs now. But that responsibility kind of shifted at some point in the business, where second assistants certainly were carrying the cameras, setting the cameras up, but it's a little more executive. But the first assistant, like Dan's explaining, you become a producer. Ultimately, you really do, because if you're not producer friendly and you're making calls that are costing thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, or costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars on a reshoot for focus, it's definitely a different way. But I loved giving the second assistant everything. On Transformers 2, Jesse had to end up doing all the coordination of the equipment between Jordan and France and and Michael Bay doesn't give you travel days. You travel and work, or work and travel. There is never a travel day that doesn't include work with Michael Bay. So we knew that we had to have everything ready. We had to have almost 2 packages prepped, one in France and one in Jordan, because the air couldn't deliver the camera fast enough. We had to fly with gear. We had to send a charter early. So he literally was responsible for queuing all the gear. And I loved watching him, you know, conquer all that and take that on. But that also allowed me to concentrate more on the focus, which, you know, was difficult on these movies, these bigger movies. On the smaller movies, everything kind of shifts, and, you know, the job positions kind of shift a little bit. But on these big, huge movies, yeah, the first assistant uh, has a lot going on. I mean, you're doing crew too. You're deciding who's best for this job. You know, okay, we need another camera crew. Okay, who do we get? We don't just, you don't just go to the first person. You have to actually look at each person and look at the situation and go, okay, this person's going to be good for that situation. Yeah, and then who's going to be complimenting them. And then, okay, well, we got 2A guys. Okay, that's great, because, you know, then they can both go off and do things. And oh, we needed you know, an operator that might be able to shoot something on the side. So, you know, it's huge as a first assistant. I don't even know how to teach how many things a first assistant is actually responsible for, because there's no book, there's no written rules, but you are ultimately a producer and the first assistant at the same time.
I remember I did this movie called Tomorrowland, and we were based in Vancouver, but we also, you know, we shot in Alberta, we shot in Los Angeles, we shot at the, you know, Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and we shot in the Bahamas and Valencia and Paris. And some of we had a charter, but sometimes we would have to split off and go to different countries. So, you know, the hardest thing to ship is the lithium ion batteries. Like, when you have to deal with shipping, the first thing you think about are how do I get the batteries there? And then once you can figure that out, then the rest is, you know, just straightforward shipping. So what we ended up doing is we ended up making battery caches, and we would we stashed a cache in, you know, we stashed a cache in the Bahamas, we stashed a cache in Europe, we stashed a cache in France, and then we stashed a cache in Florida, and we just sent them all there. And so I'm like, just change the schedule however you want to. We can just fly with what we need, and wherever we end up, I know, you know, the batteries will be there. It was wasteful money-wise, but in terms of like, guys, if you can't, if, you know, there's just so many things like George Clooney's schedule. If you can't get a firm schedule, then you just have to be honest and say, look, if you guys can't be specific, then it's going to end up being more wasteful and cost more, and this is how I have to do it to deal with it. And ultimately they're like, yeah, you know, compared to what these batteries cost, it's chump change compared to like everything else, so just go ahead and do it. And that's what we ended up doing. But suddenly it became like, you know what, we there's a hurricane in Bahamas, we have to go to Spain first, and you're like, okay, fine, no problem.
Yeah, the carnets and the and all that jazz, and dealing with that, it's a huge, you have to inventory every piece of gear. And on these bigger movies, when you have 10 plus cameras, thousands of pieces of gear and thousands, and that all have to be checked and carneted. And, you know, if one piece of gear is checked and it's not the same coming back, you know, you got issues, and that stuff can get stuck in shipping. And I've had stuff get stuck in customs, and you know, not make the next flight because something was off. And so that's a huge thing, bringing someone on just to do the carnet and the equipment. It's huge when traveling, and getting another camera body and making sure those camera bodies are going to be good when you get there. And that's I love that about the job, and I do miss that side of it. I really do miss the organization and the whole job. I do miss sometimes.
As
I
you're
mean, Top Gun was nuts because it would change. You know, I mean, they had to have stuff ready to go in every direction. Dan was just, I don't know how he did it, and I wish there was a documentary of how we do our jobs, not just on these movies, but every. You know, it's just, it's really, it's an incredible job. There's nothing like it.
I remember on Life of Pi, we had 10,000 pounds of gear because it was twin Alexa Pace 3D rigs times 3. And we, you know, we shot in Taiwan and India and Toronto. And I just remembered, like, we were leaving for Taiwan to go to India, and, you know, they had asked for weights, and, you know, I was like, okay, you know, let's charter a 737 and we'll be fine. And we get there, well, actually a 747, And we'll be fine. We get there, it's a 737 because obviously it's cheaper. But then they came up to us and we're like, oh, the gear doesn't fit. And well, I'm like, of course all the gear doesn't fit on the plane because it's a 737. And so they're like, you have to decide what goes on the plane and what doesn't. And so we go out there on the tarmac, which is actually technically it's illegal. And I think it was like a typhoon level winds. And so Tucker and I have to unpack the plane and pick what's important. And then the pilot comes up to me, is like, oh, by the way, can you put this amount of weight in the back and this amount in the front? We have to balance the plane. So I was like, okay, we have to balance the plane then. I'm like, how do I weigh all this stuff? So we ended up putting all the gear on those, those wagons that you put all the luggage on. And then I had them weigh each wagon, and then we would put the weight of each wagon. And so I could take these chunks and kind of like add and subtract to kind of make the weight fit on the plane right. And then we got in the planes, we loaded the 737s, and then we set the rest to get shipped in another way. And then we came on the plane. By that time, I think it was like 2 hours later, everyone was completely drunk on the plane. But and I gave the pilot the sheet, and he's like, wow, this is crazy. The ground crews never, ground crews don't care. They're like, this is like perfectly balanced. So because we did that, we ended up having to skip. We didn't have to refuel. We could fly directly to India. And so when we got there, we get there, we're like, thank God that's over. We go to bed. In the morning, we get a call saying, hey, you guys have to go to customs. The guy wants to talk about all the gear. And so we're like, oh God, okay. So we go to customs, and I'd worked in India before, and I'm like, well, you just pay a little bakshish, and you pay, you give the guy some money, and it's all taken care of. They're like, no, this is a Fox production, it's a racketeering act. We don't pay bribes. And so the guy was just like going through the list, picking one thing. Like he would pick a cable, which was in the 3D rack, like buried somewhere in there. And he's like, I want to see this. And so we'd have to open the racks and almost tear them apart just to show him that one barcode. And he'd be like, okay. And then he'd pick like another thing. And so I was like, okay, Tucker, distract him. And so Tucker like started getting in an argument with him. And then I ran out, and then I got like our P-Touch. And then so when he would tell Tucker the number, I would like type in the P-Touch, print out a barcode. And then like while he distracted him, I would like stick the sticker somewhere. And then so by the time he got to there, Tucker would be like, see, there it is. He's like, okay. And then he'd like take the next thing. And then Tucker would like say, oh, that's this, and that does this. And I'd run to that case, open it up. And then Tucker would get over there, and he'd open it up, and he'd be like, oh yeah, look, there it is. And be like, oh, look at that. And so I think after the guy did this about 20 times and realized that all our paperwork was perfect, he finally let us through. And the producer was like, wow, that was great. You saved me like $10,000. And I'm like, yeah, well, it was, you just have to think on your feet. And also I remember after we were done with India and we came back to Taiwan, they were like, yeah, we'll, load all the gear right out of the plane into a truck, and you'll get back. And we're like, thank God. So we get back, we land, we walk through the terminal, and we hear this huge kunk. We're like, what is that? And then our whole camera package is coming off the conveyor belts into the luggage carousel. Like just codex towers, everything is just pouring out. And we're like, oh my God. And so like we had to it was challenging. So basically we just pulled everything off, and we had to have the truck come around and like totally block the traffic in the terminal while we loaded 10,000 pounds of gear off the luggage carousel into a truck, and to get back to the stage. But I mean, these are just things that happen when you travel the world, and you just have to just be like, remember the goal is to shoot a film, and everything else is just, whether it's an impediment or something in the way, as long as you keep the goal in mind, everything else you just kind of deal with as it comes up, because all that matters is you're there, you roll cameras, you get the shots, the performance is great, and that's all that everyone's going to see. The rest you just have to deal with, because that's your job.
Yeah.
This must have been one of the best stories, actually, on the Zoom. The one
Cool.
from the custom story. I really liked it. Yeah. Are there any more questions in the chat? I don't think so. I don't see anyone. No. No, everybody's nodding no.
Yeah.
So I think we're wrapping it up. This is always where Clemens gets in and tells everybody to leave the Zoom.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for joining.
Thanks, Rose.
Thanks, Rose, for hosting. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you guys.
I would ask everybody to leave the chat now. And well, the whole interview will be available next week on the Focus Pool at Work platform, which we will completely relaunch next week. So watch out. It will be a really nice new website for first ACs. And yeah, so see you next week. And yeah, please leave the chat, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thanks, Clemens. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Connor.
See you soon.